Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to get us started. My name is Kristen Schaefer, and I'm the director of CHE, the Collaborative for Health and Environment. Thank you so much for joining us. We are very excited for today's discussion. I'm going to get us started with a few bits of housekeeping. We invite you to put a note in the chat, introducing yourself and where you're joining in from if you'd like to. If you're joining by phone, you'll be able to download the slides a bit later from today's presentation on the webinar page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. And please note that the slides and resources section on that page includes links to resources that our speakers will be referring to today. For those who are online, we'll put that link in to that webinar page into the chat now. Please type your questions into the Q&A box at any point. We'll get to as many comments and questions as we can after the presentations. We'll do our best to monitor the chat as well, but your questions may get lost there, so please do use the Q&A function. If you'd like to activate closed captions, you can do that by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and it's scheduled to last for an hour. So with that, I'm excited to move us into today's discussion. This webinar is part of a series CHE is hosting this year focused on health and climate impacts of petrochemical plastics. I'm especially excited about today's discussion as it takes a very familiar and ubiquitous product, the plastic beverage bottle, and looks in detail at how the production, use, and disposal of this product is harming people across the country, with disproportionate impacts, including high risk of cancer in communities of color and among low-income people, especially in the Southeast, along the Gulf Coast, and in Western Pennsylvania. We have some really wonderful speakers lined up for you today, and I'll introduce both of them now. First, you'll hear from John Beard Jr., the founder and executive director of Port Arthur Community Action Network in Southeast Texas, an organization working to advocate for Port Arthur residents who face chemical exposures from plastic production. John has worked for 38 years in the petrochemical industry with experience in process operations, health, safety, and environmental issues, and emergency management. He also has over 32 years of public service as an elected official, 9 as a city councilman and mayor pro tem, with current and previous service on numerous boards and commissions with the city of Port Arthur. You'll then hear from Mike Belliveau, executive director of Defend Our Health. Mike has advanced public health, environmental justice, and clean production for 40 years. He's led chemical policy reform campaigns that set national precedents, helped major corporations phase out toxic chemicals and plastics, and launched a trade association to create good jobs and slow climate change through renewable materials. Mike founded Defend Our Health, which was formerly the Environmental Health Strategy Center in 2002, previously served as executive director of Communities for a Better Environment. Mike is one of the co-authors of the report you'll be hearing about today, Hidden Hazards: The Chemical Footprint of a Plastic Bottle, was produced by Defend Our Health with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies Beyond Petrochemicals campaign. So with that, I'll turn it over first to John to share his perspective on the community level impacts of plastic production. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Kristen, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm coming to you from the beautiful city of Port Arthur, Texas, here on the Gulf Coast of Texas. If you look at the map there where you see Texas and Louisiana meet on the shores of Lake Sabine, that's us here in Port Arthur. And we are one of the major petrochemical hubs of the nation here. And virtually everything that's going on in the petrochemical industry, you will find it here. We are home to the largest refinery in the country, which is Valero. And just 15 miles to the north in the city of Beaumont, Texas, is the second largest refinery in the country. And most of these corporations, or these refineries rather, are the producers of the major feedstocks that make plastics possible. But before I get started on discussing that in a little more detail, let me give you a little bit of background about me, as was said earlier, that I have over 38 years of experience in the petrochemical industry, formerly working for ExxonMobil Corporation in process technology and also in emergency management. And my service also as an elected official here has been, I guess you'd say, very helpful in terms of making the link and bond between the petrochemical industry and the things that they do and create with the economy of here in Port Arthur as well as in Southeast Texas. But going back a little further onto this with the map and all, this entire area in Texas and Louisiana, and just to the right of Louisiana, you'll see the city of Lake Charles and Sulphur, and they are heavily and very intensely involved. And to our west of where you see Texas on all is the city of Houston, less than an hour away from Port Arthur. And all along the Gulf Coast of Texas, from Port Arthur itself to Brownsville, Corpus Christi area, is a preponderance and a propensity, a high propensity level of petrochemical facilities. And all of these facilities contribute in some form to the creation of plastics, either through the creation of those feedstocks or the further refining of those feedstocks to make the various plastic products we use. Matter of fact, it was said recently that without plastics and chemicals, it would be impossible to live. But what we're beginning to see now is the fact that those very same plastics and chemicals are showing up in the food chain. They're showing up in our oceans and seas. They're showing up in our landfills, and they are very toxic. What you have to remember about plastics is it's just another form of the very oil that comes out of the ground, the very oil that's refined here in Southeast Texas and the Permian Basin of Texas and elsewhere across the country. So let's talk about some of these pictures here. What you see is some scenes from Southeast Texas. There to the middle, you will see a ground level flare at one of the largest petrochemical and refining facilities in the country, Total Refinery here in Port Arthur. And that ground level flare is what they use to be able to depressure and relieve stress from their process when there's more pressure or more incident happens where they can't further refine a product. So they simply just burn it off. And while that may look very pretty to you, there's a hidden danger behind it. It's what you don't see that's the problem. And that is the gases and the off-gassing that comes from that, the unburnt particles and substances that are released into the air, much of which is toxic. Above that, you will see one of the same petrochemical facilities there at night with the various towers and vessels and all that are used to further refine petrochemical products and create the base stocks for plastics. And then to the right of our screen there at the bottom, that large plume you see, that's a picture of one of the, I guess you say, gross and serial polluters in all of Texas, Oxbow Calcinining, which by the way is a Koch brothers company. And they basically refine petroleum coke, which is essentially coal that is made from oil. The residual oil that's left after all of the extractions have been done in the petrochemical and refining plants, that is taken and processed and turned into a substance that's very much like coal to be burned in furnaces and boilers, but also used as carbon black in tires and in some medicines and cosmetics. But what you see here is when they take these very substances, this coke, this petroleum coke, and burn off the pollutants from it. And those pollutants are what you see in the air in the form of sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide, and particulate matter in the 2.5 micron range. That's extremely dangerous because it can be ingested into your body and directly into your bloodstream simply from inhalation. So we're exposed to those things 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Next slide, please. And right here, you'll see some of the various sources based on ProPublica study that they did of this area of some of the toxic substances and places that are releasing petrochemical hazards into the very air that we have to breathe. We have some of the worst air quality in the entire country, as well as in Texas. You have Premcor Refining, that is also Valero in Port Arthur, BASF Total Petrochemicals, who is also one of the third largest emitter of benzene in the entire country. You have the DuPont Sabine River Works in Orange, Texas, which is about 20 miles from Port Arthur. And then you have the ExxonMobil Beaumont Refinery. You have Goodyear Tire and Rubber. You have Huntsman Petrochemicals Port Neches facility, which is now having recently been bought up by Motiva. So it's now Motiva Chemicals. who also bought up the Flint Hills Resources facility here in Port Arthur. So they have two facilities, with a third one being planned, a $6.2 billion expansion to create another petrochemical facility. And then you have Veolia Solutions, which basically takes poisons and toxins from other places that don't want them and bury them in the ground here. They inject them into the ground after they've been neutralized and changed in their form or incinerated. All of those pollutants and all of that is right here in a very environmentally sensitive area, and also a highly and densely populated area of over 250,000 people right here in Southeast Texas. Next slide. You also can see the footprint of the Huntsman Petrochemical Facility, which is located in Port Neches, Texas, just down the way from us here. And it's just down the street from Port Neches Groves Elementary. And if you look, it's almost in very close proximity to a number of homes and houses and other places that people inhabit. So they don't put these things in communities that are, I guess you'd say, affluent or wealthy. They don't put them in Beverly Hills or River Oaks in Houston or Madison Avenue. They are largely located in communities of color where people are, in some cases, and pretty much the majority of, low income and do not have the means to fight back against these multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. But not only do we have a high incidence of cancer here, and also heart, lung, and kidney disease brought on in large part by the petrochemical emissions, but we also have, as I mentioned earlier, Total being the third largest emitter of benzene in the country, and also Indorama, which is the largest emitter of ETO, which is also carcinogenic into the atmosphere, into the air that we breathe here in Southeast Texas. And let's not leave out Oxbow, as we saw earlier, with the 11,000 tons of particulate matter that they release a year, every year, for the past 20 years or better. They've been in business over 80 years and continue to do that. But you also have places like Valero, and they have over 600 air quality violations in a 5-year period. So you have a very heavily, intensely populated area with petrochemicals and also the contaminants and pollutants that come with them. Next slide. This is the picture again of that ground level flare, a bit of a video from it. And if you go to our website and go online, you can also see the unseen gases and emissions that come from that flaring. And what you don't see is what's really dangerous, because those substances that aren't seen, that aren't completely burned, are suspended in the air that we have to breathe here in Southeast Texas. Take a good look at that sign, because it's been changed since Mike last took these videos of it, of a gentleman that owns a fireworks stand in close proximity right off the highway to that. And someone took black paint and blotted out the knot, so it says now Total is a good neighbor. But that sign has been turned around where you can't see it any longer. So we're going to have to look at a way to help those guys out to be able to publicize that. So I'm going to be soliciting a lot of the companies and all that are in this movement to end the terror that's being rained on communities like mine from fossil fuels and other emissions from these toxic facilities, so that there's a more permanent sign that can't be obliterated or damaged in such a way, so the real message gets out that Total is not a good neighbor. Is there another slide? Okay, so then we have the hidden hazards that come up, from this, that are there. But largely what I want to speak to you about is the very fact that in making these plastics, in doing the things that we're doing with those plastics, plastic proliferation, as I like to call it, has now manifested itself in the food chain, in our oceans and our seas. It has impacted our very lives. As a matter of fact, having recently returned from the INC conference on plastics in Paris, France, we've learned that pregnant women and their unborn children are now showing signs of microplastics and plastic pollution and substances from that, the contaminants, the toxins in those unborn children and in the placentas of the mothers that carried them and also in the mothers. When the pollution becomes so rampant that it now shows up in the food chain and in the very health and lives of people such as ourselves, then it's time for us to take some action. We have to realize that we've gone too far with petrochemicals and plastic pollution. So now we have to find a different way and a better way. We have to get rid of those plastics like PET that put these toxins and substances into the things we eat and drink. Always be mindful and remember that all plastics is just another form of fossil fuel. It's just another form of oil out of the ground. And no matter how you change it or refine it, it still has its very basic element as a toxin. Our indigenous brothers and sisters love to say that the reason why it's in the ground is because it's bad. And when it's bad, you bury it so that it can't be uncovered. But now we use it. And while it has done good things in our lives to some degree, we're now finding that there are bad things that come from this. So we have to shift and move away from fossil fuels and the byproducts and products that come from that. And that includes plastics. So once again, I invite you to look into Port Arthur, to go on our Facebook page, our environmental justice website, also go on our webpage for Pecan and see what this actually looks like and what's going on here and how the lives of people are being impacted. That we are a cancer cluster here because of all the environmental contamination. We have over twice the state and national average for cancer, as well as heart, lung, and kidney disease. And we like to say sometimes here that, when we travel and go to other places and bring this message of the dangers of these substances, that before we left, we had to bury people who died of cancer and numerous other maladies that are caused by this pollution. And while we're away and talking and discussing these things across the country and around the world, people are still dying and becoming sick. And when we get back home, there'll be even more people who are becoming sick and some whom are dying and that we're going to have to bury. So let's be mindful of these things and the health effects and how it affects the very life and existence of us that live here. This is a very serious matter. It is also a major factor in climate change. And we have to do something and take action to reduce the toxic effects of using plastics and petrochemicals in our world if we are to be safe and live healthy and productive lives. So once again, thank you very much for this opportunity. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Mike, take it away.
John, thank you so much for your leadership for environmental health and climate justice, not only for the residents of Southeast Texas, but for the entire planet. I greatly appreciate what you're doing and keep letting us know how we can be helpful. So we're going to shift and step back now and approach this from the perspective of everyday plastic products in our lives. We embarked upon this effort to examine the chemical footprint of a plastic bottle in partnership with the Beyond Petrochemicals campaign of Bloomberg Philanthropy. And first, just to briefly.
Mike, it looks like you are on mute.
Yes, now I'm unmuted, sorry.
Yeah, and go ahead and put your video on as well.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
And let me back up a little bit. So Defender Health, we've been around for 20 years. These are just some images from our organization, working at the state and national level to make sure that every American has equal access to safe food and drinking water, healthy homes, clean air, and toxic-free and climate-friendly products. Let's take a step back and consider the larger challenge. Plastics are driving the production of petrochemicals, which are driving the extraction of fossil gas and crude oil. Today, about 80% of petrochemicals go to make plastics, about 5 to 10% of all fossil gas, or about 10% of fossil gas and crude oil go into the production of petrochemicals. But the International Energy Agency estimates that under the business as usual scenario, by 2050, more than half of all oil and gas demand will be feeding the petrochemical beast. And so this is a challenge because plastics production is growing exponentially, and that's clearly not sustainable. So that's the big picture. This is the cover of our recent report that came out 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, Hidden Hazards. And again, it's an example. We should be examining all plastic items of everyday use and tracing back the impacts and holding the downstream companies accountable for reducing the harm across their plastic supply chain. This is just one example of how to understand it and how to make it actionable. We already know that looking at supply chain carbon impacts, greenhouse gas emissions is a very well-developed standard and methodology. Companies are already beginning to do that. Plastics is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The Chemical Footprint Project is advancing this notion of looking at the chemical hazards associated with products, similar to the way we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And we're advising them on extending that to look upstream at the supply chain impacts. And then emerging is this notion that we now have the data and tools to actually quantify what the embedded racism is in everyday products based on the disproportionate impacts that a supply chain is having all along the way at every step. So, supply chain accountability is like a next frontier for plastics, and we examine ways of getting a handle on that. To jump to the bottom line, this is some of the coverage of the report release. The framing that Grist had was spot on. Plastic bottles harm human health at every stage of their life cycle, and that downstream companies need to be held accountable for the supply chain impacts of their plastics. One of the first steps in looking at a material and determining its supply chain impacts is knowing what the process flow is. It does require a little chemistry, but graphically on the left-hand side is in the form of a bottle is represented the same process flow horizontally across the screen. One branch is derived from fossil gas, and other branches derived from crude oil. Certain chemicals, ethylene, paraxylene, are extracted or manufactured from those fossil fuels, and then building block chemicals, in this case, purified terephthalate acid and monoethylene glycol, are manufactured and combined to form PET plastic. In the final reaction, you always need a spice or a catalyst to speed the reaction. In this case, the dominant catalyst is antimony, which is a very problematic material that's also carried forward into the plastic and doesn't stay there. So knowing the chemistry, knowing the process flow is the first step. And then we can map the chemical supply chain, which is what we did here for PET plastic. This is Brenda Hampton, who lives near this Indorama facility in Decatur, Alabama. Oops, let me just get a pointer here. Here in this location where PET resin is manufactured, but also terephthalate acid. The green circles are where the PET resin is manufactured in North America. The orange circles are the primary petrochemicals and building block substances used to make PET, manufactured in these locations, particularly in the Gulf Coast. Here's the Port Arthur area, and they are supplied to the resin plants. And then the blue circles are where the antimony is mined in Mexico and smelted in Mexico and on Montana to provide its use as a catalyst. It's also used as an additive in other plastics. So mapping the supply chain is an important aspect of documenting the hazards. Now, don't get bogged down by the fine print. I'll go into some of these details in subsequent slides, but this is the summary of the impact at every point, from extraction to petrochemical manufacturing to resin production and waste consumption and waste management. We're seeing impacts. 6 known or probable human carcinogens are uniquely associated with PET plastic. I'll drill down on those in a moment. The burden of impact in terms of air emissions around the plants fall disproportionately on brown and black residents and lower income people and workers who work nearby, but also on a population-wide consumer basis. We also see racial disparities and age disparities that put young children at risk from exposure to some of these same plastic-related chemicals like antimony. And clearly, this is not sustainable. Almost all PET plastic and plastic in general is derived from fossil carbon. As John was saying, recycling rates are pathetic. And even if they're improved, we can't recycle our way out of the problems. And then the greenhouse gas emissions are rapidly increasing. The chemical sector and the plastic sector may be the only sector of our economy whose carbon footprint is rapidly increasing. So I'll drill down on some of these findings here, but we also need to step back and say, where are these materials used? This is a end market pie chart showing that about 2/3 of PET is actually polyester fiber. Polyester is just PET in fiber form, and about over a quarter of it is packaging. But when you break that down, a good chunk of the polyester is for clothing, including fast fashion, which might be worn 3 or 4 times and thrown away. And bottles dominate the packaging. So in total, about a quarter of all PET goes to plastic bottles, and about a quarter goes into polyester clothing. Those are the dominant end uses. And obviously, we drill down on bottles as an example here. We're going to walk you backwards up the supply chain, starting from where you see the bottles lying along the road, mainly at the end of life. So this is an important finding here that I'll make mention of later as well. But there's now new research that shows that even the mechanical recycling of PET plastic bottles forms toxic byproducts, benzene and styrene, that are not present in virgin PET. And that's probably due to the entrainment of PVC and polystyrene plastic during the collection. In the United States, here's the typical fate of a plastic bottle. Less than 30% or about 30% is collected for recycling. That means 70% is wasted, landfilled, incinerated, dumped by the roadside. And of the 30% that's collected, only about a third of that ends up going back to bottles. About a third of it is actually wasted during the recycling process, which I was kind of shocked to learn because it's too contaminated with adhesive labels and PVC plastic sleeves and dirt and crud. It just ends up going back to the landfill. And then the rest is downcycled, meaning it goes to low quality fiber use, which is typically a single use. The 30% collection is for the bottles. The recycling of polyester clothing is about 0.1%. It's very limited. And here's the site to the study about the toxic byproducts formed during recycling. I think there'll be more research findings on that to come. So then we move upstream to the consumer, on the shelf. And the Food Packaging Forum has done, and others have done excellent work in documenting the peer-reviewed literature that shows that 150 different chemicals are known to migrate from plastic bottles into beverages. And here's a little infographic from last year that focuses on one substance on the left, which is antimony. This happens to be one of the compounds and ions that we know the most about that migrate out of PET plastic. Many of the substances we know too little about. We tested plastic bottled beverages for antimony last year, and here are the results. 40% of the samples tested, the antimony levels in the beverage itself exceeded the California public health goal for antimony in drinking water. And the lighter highlighted values exceeded an action level that we thought was more appropriate, taking into account that kids especially are also exposed to antimony in household dust, where it's used as an adjunct to flame retardants, and toddlers with frequent hand-to-mouth activity ingest a lot of dust. And so there's greater exposure from other sources. This is a concern. Now, the enforceable drinking water standard is too high, so the industry position is we're in compliance, so what is there to worry about? But who wants to microdose with toxic chemicals that are carcinogens? This antimony is a probable human carcinogen, upgraded in the last 18 months in the US and internationally. The California public health goal is based on systemic organ toxicity to the liver. So daily exposure, particularly young children, to antimony from all sources is probably unsafe today. So more action is needed there. And that's just one of the substances we know about that migrates. So if we look at, go a step further to the PET resin manufacturing plants in North America, primarily located in the Southeast and the Ohio River Valley, we see other hazards. One hazard uniquely associated with PET, and this is where they're concentrated in the Southeast and on the Ohio River. One hazard uniquely associated with this plastic is 1,4-dioxane. Some of you know that substance because it's a byproduct contaminant in some cosmetics based on certain precursor chemicals that have been used in personal care products. But it's the largest release of 1,4-dioxane into the environment is actually from the manufacture of PET resin. Not only is it a probable human carcinogen, but it's extremely persistent in water. It just doesn't break down. And EPA has yet to adopt a enforceable maximum contaminant level for drinking water, but based on the hazard assessments that have been done, we know that in many communities, the levels are too high. And in those plants that I showed on the previous slide, several of them discharge directly into rivers or through sewage treatment plants into rivers that are upstream of drinking water intakes on the Ohio River and in the Cape Fear region. How do we know that this industry is number one? Well, here's the toxics release inventory data. These are the 10 or 9 PET resin manufacturing plants in the United States. And among the more than 20,000 industrial facilities that report to EPA every year on toxic releases, here's how these plants rank for releases of 1,4-dioxane. You can see that they're the top polluters for discharge directly into rivers or into sewage treatment plants. And they're also among the top polluters for releases into air. 1,4-dioxane tends to break down in air, but you wouldn't want to breathe it before that happens. So this is a problem, an underreported problem, uniquely associated with PET plastic. So let's move upstream. One of the building block substances for to make PET is monoethylene glycol, or MEG, or just called ethylene glycol. And this is Diane Wilson, who you know as one of the heroes of holding Formosa Plastics accountable for plastic pollution on Lithaka Bay in the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico and Texas. The big concern with this step in the process is not so much the MEG, and this shows back to the map where these plants are located and what they make, but it's the ethylene oxide, because the process is you take ethylene from fossil gas, you turn it into ethylene oxide, and then most of the ethylene oxide is turned into MEG, and almost all the MEG is used to make PET plastic. As John pointed out, the number one industrial air emission source of ethylene oxide is located in his neighborhood in Port Neches, next to Port Arthur, posing very high cancer risk for environmental exposures. In fact, EPA estimates that the majority of cancer risk associated with industrial emissions of hazardous air pollutants throughout the entire United States can be attributed to ethylene oxide. And in 2016, it was determined that it was definitely a human carcinogen, and it was about 60 times more potent than previously thought. Now, there is a pending rule that EPA has proposed that would partially reduce ETO emissions, but they have failed to require leakless valves, which is an available control technology that would still leave more than 3 million people at serious cancer risk if the rule was adopted without weakening changes directly associated with ethylene oxide used to supply the production of PET. Again, here's just a quick thing on the cancer risk, ethylene oxide. EPA celebrates that their rule would reduce 96% of the number of people at risk greater than 100 in a million for cancer risk, which is progress. But look at the vast majority that are exposed at lower but still significant risk, either at 10 in a million or 1 in a million. We only get a 21% reduction, leaving more than 5 million people, 64% of whom are Latinx and African-American residents who live within 50 kilometers of these plants. So we have, EPA needs to do more there. And here again are the, how we know that the ethylene oxide manufacturing plants are significant. These are 10 of the 12 plants that manufacture ethylene oxide in the United States that we know supply the process of making PET resin and polyester fiber. And they are the largest ethylene oxide sources in the country, not surprisingly. And they're all located in Texas, Louisiana, a very, very significant cancer risk that for too long has been unattended. So this is well known to residents of the Gulf Coast, and it's attributed to the chemical industry, but we need to connect the dots here. What's driving cancer risk in the Gulf Coast from ethylene oxide is PET plastic, and ever increasing, which is projected to double in amount in the next decade. So we need to hold the downstream companies that are consuming that plastic accountable for the environmental injustice and harm to human health caused upstream in their supply chain, including ethylene oxide. So ethylene oxide comes from ethylene. Ethylene itself is low to moderate or unknown toxicity, but ethylene, the chemical ethylene, it's one of the top 3 chemicals. If you think, you know, we probably manufacture well over 30,000 chemicals in the United States, more globally, and ethylene is in the top 3 for greenhouse gas emission intensity. It's a very intensive process. 40 to 50% of the fossil gas that's brought in to make ethylene is actually burned to power the high temperature, high pressure process to crack ethane into ethylene. So it's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions that also is rapidly growing. Ethylene comes from fossil gas. This is the Permian oil basin, the Permian Basin in Texas and Oklahoma, where the majority, a large portion of the oil and fossil gas in the United States comes from. We used Coca-Cola Company as a case study in this report, and we're able to trace the fossil carbon used in their plastic bottles directly back to the Permian Basin. Now, on this arm of the production, only 20% of the carbon comes from fossil gas. For other plastics, like polyethylene, it's all fossil gas based. So it's both gas and oil, depending on the type of plastic. I won't go deep into the impacts here. There's more in the report, but we'll go down now the other chain, the other stream. PTA or TPA, terephthalate acid, is the other building block chemical. Here's Brenda again with the Indorama facility in Decatur. One of the concerns here is they use cobalt to catalyze the conversion of paraxylene to terephthalate acid. Cobalt, many of the cobalt compounds are also probable human carcinogens, and EPA's risk screening says that this is a significant, very significant hazard nationwide and in these regions. That TPA, or purified terephthalate acid, comes from paraxylene, which comes from oil refineries. I think this is the Whiting refinery in Indiana, which obviously comes from crude oil. In addition to the xylene, you get benzene and toluene, so there are a lot of emissions. And this is the Alberta tar sands, and Jean Lomcourt, First Nation activist working to clean up that mess or stop the mess, a significant source. We know the impacts are disproportionate up and down the supply chain. These are the facilities with a quadrant of percent people of color across the horizontal or x-axis, and percent low-income population in the vertical axis, the y-axis, among people who live within 3 miles of these plants. Each dot is one of the plants in the chemical supply chain. So you see that well over half of the facilities are in communities that are predominantly people of color, residents close to the facility, and the vast majority are in lower income communities. And the hazards, especially with ethylene oxide, extend far beyond 3 miles. Within 31 miles, that 50-kilometer radius, we're still seeing significant cancer risk from ethylene oxide. Again, we tally up the conclusions. Chemical footprint is an accounting, and some of these are repeated here in conclusion. We also draw out the opportunity to extend this same model of mapping and footprinting to other plastics, and we draw out some common lessons. Then we have some actionable recommendations specific to PET. The beverage companies could, if they chose, tomorrow require their resin producers to end the use of antimony and cobalt, because there are safer alternatives available already in the marketplace. And Coca-Cola alone consumes about 20% of all the plastic bottles in the world. There's 500 billion plastic bottles consumed every year. And so Coke and Pepsi alone, if they said, we want this, the resin producers would say, how quickly do you need it? So we're asking them to take that action. And these facilities are upstream that I mentioned should be virtually zero discharge. Technology is available to virtually eliminate 1,4-dioxane emissions to drinking water sources and to virtually eliminate ethylene oxide air emissions. We just need the political will to require it. There's more that needs to be done, and obviously a key factor in this particular product is replacing plastic bottles. Many of our allies, we join in supporting their ask that at least half of the plastic bottles be replaced with reusable and refillable containers by the year 2030, the end of this decade. I mentioned the EPA rule that's pending. Comment period is open to June 26th. I encourage you to submit a comment about EPA needing to require all available control technologies, not leave anything on the table to reduce emissions of ethylene oxide. There's an action on our website that can take you there. And obviously much more needs to be done. And then this should be, the same approach should be applied to other plastic items. We just picked plastic bottles as an iconic product that everyone could relate to tell a story about all the harm associated with it up and down the supply chain. But the same story needs to be told for all the other plastic items in our lives. And then we need to talk to the company, the Coca-Colas and the other downstream companies and the retailers and say, look, you're part of the solution. We'll never convince ExxonMobil and Dow Chemical to voluntarily reduce the production of petrochemicals and plastics, but we can and must persuade the corporate consumers of these materials to reduce their use, to detoxify the material, to end the environmental injustice, and to convert to more sustainable materials and solutions. We can do this. There are it's a feasible set of things that we can do. And so I will try to turn off this pointer and end there. Look forward to a few minutes of discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. And thanks to both of you, John and Mike, for your incredible leadership. John, for your efforts to protect your community and also just build awareness of how serious this problem is, and get the word out about that and help to mobilize action. And Mike, for your incredible work on this for so many years, and also to your team for this report. I really commend the report to folks. I know that you touched on a lot. We went through a lot in this presentation, but there's a lot more in that report. So if folks have a chance to download that and read through it, I really recommend it. We have a lot of good questions. I want to start with one of my own, actually, which follows up on your point, John, that you just are back from Paris and the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations there. And I'm wondering, in terms of solutions and ways to move forward, I'm wondering if you can just share any reflections on kind of what the progress and potential progress might be in that arena. And how important it is for folks to pay attention. And we're also going to be talking about other levels of action, but I thought it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on that.
Sure, that can be summed up pretty easily, because the first 2.5 days was basically spent I guess you would say, squabbling procedurally about how to go about doing this and having these discussions. Matter of fact, the representatives from the Soviet Union or from Russia, as well as those from Saudi Arabia, were constantly raising questions, raising objections, and not a lot got done. But finally, we started making some progress with a draft document and discussing and dealing with certain aspects and issues of it. But the politics did try to reign. You know, it was a big fight between the three forces: the governments, the politics between those governments, and the industry itself, and then the frontline activists and others such as myself that were there in attendance. It was very difficult to sit and hear 5-minute diatribes by those who are in opposition or wanted to bring these things up. And then when it's time for the observers and those like myself to speak, you've got 1 minute. But there were work sessions that went on. So movement is happening, but there's going to have to be a lot done between now and Nairobi, which will be sometimes in November, to address fully fleshing out this document, especially in terms of indigenous rights and the impact on affected communities. That has to be manifested in that procedure and document. Matter of fact, it was just the last day and a half that some of this work came about because of all the stonewalling and foot dragging. But the representative of Mexico, I just have to commend her for her efforts to basically stand up and wave her name tag. And you see the thing like at the UN with the name bars in front of people. Well, she had to virtually get up and just, you know, act like a cheerleader and do a jumping jack to get the attention of the chairman to be able to say, we've made a decision to move forward. Why are we discussing why we made a decision to move forward when we have consensus? Let's go do the work and then come back and go from there. And it's a rousing applause, but the work is being done, but it's difficult and it's slow, but it will get done. There's a lot of determination by all of the member organizations in terms of the different countries and the advocates for addressing this problem to continue to work together and find ways to do it. Even when they tried not to allow us to speak, they stood up and got together and ceded their time to us. So now there was no reason to block us from speaking, even though they tried to limit the time that you could speak. But we found ways to constantly work around it and work through to be heard and to address the concerns and issues and to basically say that we have to address plastic pollution and we have to not just recycle and reuse, but we have to change the way we approach this completely because of the supply chain and the toxicity that comes from it. So it was very interesting, and I'm looking forward to continuing the work. And you know, everybody needs to keep their eyes and ears open, stay aware, be aware of what's happening, and you know, continue to work wherever they can to help us in this fight.
Great, and encouraging that you were there to sort of share the on the ground community perspective of what some of the harms are of plastic production. Mike, anything to add on that before we jump to the other questions?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So before a lot of these questions are about sort of solutions and what can be done. There was one question before we jump to that I wanted to address and have you address, Mike, which is what is the carbon and I assume chemical footprint of plastic straws compared to bottles? Any sense?
Straws are made. Plastic straws are made of what? Polyethylene, I think. We are taking a look at polyethylene and other major uses. It's you know, all plastics are of environmental health concern. It used to be that the environmental health community would say, oh, well, polyethylene, polypropylene, those are the clean plastics, and we need to worry about polyvinyl chloride and polystyrene. There are obvious toxic hazards associated with the latter plastics, but if you ever live or visited a community where polyethylene or polypropylene is manufactured, you know that there are serious impacts. And as I mentioned, there's growing impacts in terms of greenhouse gases. So when we start comparing one product to another, we can get bogged down. We need to keep our eyes on the prize, which is eliminating unnecessary uses of plastics, first and foremost, detoxifying plastics wherever we can, and then switching to more sustainable solutions, including more sustainable materials, including renewable carbon, when that is also possible. If we can triangulate by pursuing all those strategies in parallel, we can reach the long-term goal of having a materials economy that is safe and just and sustainable. It's not going to happen overnight, but there are victories all along the way that we can target and bring in.
Yeah. And I appreciate the point you made that this report focused on, plastic beverage bottles is sort of one example of how you can use this for various products. And again, with the goal of raising awareness and holding the corporations accountable as well. So there's a handful of questions folks have asked about how to pressure the regulatory agencies, EPA. So Beth asks, what is needed to empower EPA to endeavor for public health interests to remedy the shocking information shared today? What can we do to require regulation? Also a question comparing what will it take for the US to pursue a similar approach that Canada and the EU has already implemented with regard to banning single-use plastic, with a link to Canada's regulations here. And then there was another, what actions, what would you say are some of the more powerful laws requiring EPA to better regulate plastics and the corresponding toxins? So kind of bundled those together. Mike, do you want to take a first crack at that? And then John.
Or John, do you want to go first? Or
Oh, John, you have your hand up. Yeah, you go ahead.
Sure, I'll go first. Well, first of all, they've done some things initially. There was a listening session done with EPA with regard to the ETO emissions at Indorama, but we have to request more of them. Various groups and organizations have to petition EPA through their regional administrator as well as the national office with regard to air quality to ask for hearings in those areas that are heavily impacted, number one, to me. Also, they have to make their elected officials more aware of the danger and the hazard. Too many of these government bodies see this as a means of making money and also, tax revenue and base and jobs, but they dismiss the fact of the environmental and human health hazards that come from this. So you have to embark on a path of giving them that knowledge and that education so that they will know what to do on that, and then push, prod, write letters, make phone calls, begin a movement to encourage the EPA to take this action and do it. And they are looking at it, but we have to continue with unrelenting toil to keep pushing them to move in that direction, as well as our governments to do so. And we have to do so strategically because these companies use their billions of dollars to lobby and use activists to put rules in place that make our job even more difficult. So while there's yet time, we need to intervene and act in that way and to encounter them and to push for these changes and to use what Canada's done in terms of their regulations to demand that they do something, because this is a public health issue. And as a last resort, because of what we know already, these companies that use these substances have created a liability. They're affecting human health. And we need to pursue that. No different than what we've done in pursuing tobacco or asbestos, or even now baby powder. We have to do that because once they see that there's no longer profit to be made there and turn the tide of public opinion and I guess you'd say social license to be able to do this and use these products and make them, then they will shift away from it. So we have to take an all-encompassing strategy to look at that and to address this. And that takes people and that takes action.
Yeah, right on, John. I totally agree, and would add to that, the Biden administration, they want to do the right thing to a degree, for public health and environmental justice and climate change. But remember what President Obama told us: you got to make me do it. President Obama didn't even mention climate change until his last year in office in his State of the State. So we have to make the administration do the right thing. And so one specific thing everyone on this call should do is send a comment to EPA before the June 26th deadline on their proposal to crack down on toxic air emissions from chemical manufacturing. There's an action on our website that can take you there, or you can look up the HON rule on EPA, and it's very simple to send an email with your reasons, personal or professional or otherwise, as to why EPA should do more. And specifically, they need to require all available control technologies. There's no reason why every chemical plant, which might have thousands of connections, they need to replace those with leakless equipment. There are zero emitting valves and pumps that EPA is not requiring. that work. They need to replace those so that they're zero emitting. And John, you mentioned the thermal imaging or the optical gas monitoring that can measure or visualize invisible plumes of gases. EPA needs to require that at every one of these chemical plants so that they're timely detecting leaks and correcting them. And lastly, they're not requiring that. And the other thing they're not requiring are leak detection, automated leak detection sensor networks. If we can have a smart home where to push a button, we can control the temperature and know what's going on all over our home, there's no reason why we can't have a smart chemical plant that monitors every connection in the plant and immediately detects any leaks and corrects them. So that's another available technology that EPA is not required. So three things are not in this rule that they could do to crack down on the leaking emissions, the so-called fugitive emissions. So send a letter by June 26th to the EPA rulemaking docket.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. And so there are several questions about sort of sample letters and talking points and whatnot. And it sounds like folks can find those kind of things on your website. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay,
Yes.
That's great. We have time for two more questions before we wrap up. So one is kind of going back to the climate link. Tamila Trussell asks, are there numbers of what % the plastics life cycle contributes to greenhouse gases? I'm on a local climate committee that is downplaying GHG contributions because they can't quantify scope 1, 2, 3 for decreasing single-use plastics. Either of you have any thoughts on that? Is there information in the report that she can go to? Or?
There's a little bit of information in the report, and Beyond Plastics also did a good report about a year and a half ago on the climate greenhouse gas impacts of plastics. They're going to outpace coal for greenhouse gas emissions by the end of the decade in the United States. Also, CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, did another good documentation report in 2019 on greenhouse gas emissions associated with plastics. It's probably about 4 or 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions today can be assigned to petrochemical plastics, but the plastics is doubling in production with greater and greater frequency. So it's going to grow significantly over time.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we're tight on time, but I do want to get to one more question, then I'll ask you both for some final thoughts before we have some wrap-up announcements. So this question, again, to end on sort of the solution side, what state strategy with community groups has made the most progress? John, do you want to give that a go first? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. There's no specific thing, but one of the things we do, and we have what we call inform, educate, and then energize. We have to inform and educate people as to the hazards and the effect on public health. In most of the cases, as we've said earlier, these are communities of color that have been adversely affected by environmental pollution for decades. We have to show the link between what's in the air you breathe, the water you drink, the land in which you live on, of how it's affecting you. Like I said, here in Port Arthur, we have a cancer cluster. No one, since we found this out in 2010, has done any research on it. Not the city, county government, state, or on the federal level has done anything to determine if there's an environmental cause. Well, that's where we got to start first, because people are dying at an abnormally high rate of these abnormal cancers and having COPD and all of these things in a climate such as this, whereas people who do not have these facilities around them or live in close proximity don't have that. So that's a public health issue. And then once we start to address that and find out where the sources are, and we already have that information because a lot of this is self-reporting by the companies, and many of them are already in violation. So we've got to get the enforcement agencies involved to do something. We've got to get the medical community and those in terms of public health to do something and to be active. But it all begins with educating people, because there's a saying, as I was responding to Lonnie Graham, when you know better, you should do better. You should do better. When you know it's going to hurt and harm you, then you have to. And one of the things I saw earlier is we have to tell all of these companies and people, in the work that's going on. They're wanting to expand and do more because that's what's happening. The refining side is shifting now to the petrochem side to make more plastics. So more is on the way. And that's why I'm in this fight, because I have to get my peers and others to understand that we can recycle and do all those other things that they talk about and technologically work our way out of this if we'd like. But if you don't stop the supply in the upstream side that is producing the precursor chemicals that make all of this possible, your work will be for nothing. You'll be cleaning up and they'll be making twice as much as you can clean up. And you can't even clean it up fast enough. So we have to educate and inform people. When you know better, you do better. And then we have to hold ourselves and others, especially our elected officials and those decision makers, and not only in government, but in big business, to do better. They should do no harm. And if you're harming people, then you should be held accountable. And that, I think, will address their social license aspect as well as their financial aspect, because they don't do this because they like to. They do it to make money. Go after the money. Let's attack the money. When you do that, you'll get them to change. I guarantee it.
Thank you so much, John. It's a powerful message. Mike, do you have any final comments? Maybe you can fold in that question about, what
Sure.
state strategies.
There's actions that every town and city can take, and many states are able to take as well to knock out certain single-use disposable plastics for which we simply don't need, or for which there are readily available alternatives, whether it's plastic cutlery or straws or plastic bags. One annoying plastic product is the polystyrene foam packaging peanuts, completely unnecessary. Every place that sells them also sells the starch-based alternatives that dissolve in water. Those should just be banned outright. So, depending on your reach and your city, town, or state, there are many actions that can be taken. And I guess just in closing, I would say that I remain hopeful. I mean, it is daunting. We do need to bend the curve down, as John was saying, and reduce the production of hazardous petrochemicals and plastics, while also figuring out a just transition that enables people to be prosperous and to make a living. We can do that because there are safer and more just and sustainable materials that we can be manufacturing that aren't not based on fossil carbon. So there's a positive future to pursue. And if we make progress every year and keep our eyes on the big goals, we can bend this curve down and make progress.
Well, that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank you so much, Mike and John, for sharing your important insight and work with us today. It's critically important. And also thanks to everyone for today's participation and your thoughtful questions and engagement. And if you're interested in this topic, please keep an eye out for future webinars on the life cycle health impacts of plastics in the CHE newsletter and on our website.